Marlin or Marion Robb, two different spellings. Missing 06/05/26, Unk, 20 miles north of Paragoula, Utah. Age at disappearance, 17 years. This incident is centered on a region in the far southwestern portion of Utah. Paragoula is a very small city, 20 miles from Bryce and Zion National Park and 40 miles north of the Arizona border. The incident occurred in a region 20 miles south of Paragoula, near the Cottonwood Canyon. This location is approximately 4 miles from Cane Point. This isn't the only story about sheep herders that I have ever encountered. Missing 411 Eastern United States has an entire chapter dedicated to sheep herders that have vanished under unusual circumstances. The Robb family was sheep herders, and the two brothers had the responsibility to take care of the herd. Articles spelled the name of the victim in this story two different ways, Marlin and Marion. For consistency, in this story I will call him Marlin. Something had been stealing sheep belonging to the Robbs, and the boys had decided to ride out separate and look for the culprit. Marlin had told his brother he had seen a coyote and was going to ride out and kill it. This was the last time Marlin was seen. A June 8, 1926, article in the Billings Gazette had the following headline: Hounds to seek youth all likely taken by beast. When Marlin didn't return, Marlin's brother had ridden out to find his brother and found his horse. There was blood on the saddle, and his brother's hat was sitting on the saddle horn. The brother searched further and found a location where he believed his brother had sat down. There was more blood and his brother's rifle. He searched into the night and couldn't find Marlin. He rode back to the community and asked for assistance. The family had some type of political connections because articles state that Utah Governor George Dern sent special bloodhounds to the area to assist in the effort to find Marlin. TINS went back to the area where Marlin's brother had found blood and the rifle, and in a region further away from that scene, searchers found Marlin's knife and parts of his clothing saturated in blood. There were two sites where it appeared that Marlin had sat and rested. The rifle that was found was still loaded. A June 8, 1926, article in the Salt Lake Tribune explained what happened when the bloodhounds came onto the scene. Bloodhounds were put on the scent, but the animals appeared to be bewildered and could not follow the scent. Hundreds of men have joined in the hunt and covered every foot of the ground in Cottonwood Canyon for a radius of 25 miles with no trace of the missing boy than his knife and gun and the clots of blood where they were found. The search for Marlin went on for weeks with upward of 1,000 men from throughout the state participating in the effort to find the sheepherder. After almost 3 weeks of intensive search, with bloodhounds from all different parts of the state and many woodsmen and other sheepherders, Marlin was not found, and the search was terminated. In late October 1933, deer hunter Archie Lamoureux was in and are 6 miles from the 1926 Robb sheepherding camp when he made an unusual find. Archie found bits of clothing, bits of shoes, and a partial skeleton. The remains were turned over to the sheriff, who identified the remains as Marlin. There was no information on the terrain where the body was found or the condition of the remains, and there was never a statement on the cause of death. Summary: this entire event is mired in confusing information. Some articles state that Marlin vanished 20 miles northwest of Paragoula, and some say southwest. Cottonwood Canyon is southwest. Some articles state it was Marion who was Jost, some say Marlin. I find it very, very unusual that the newspaper articles mentioned the strange behavior of the bloodhounds refusing to track. Again, unusual behavior by CA9s plays a major role in a disappearance. I know that some of you may feel that a cougar or bear took down Marlin. I don't think so. The boy was able to get to 2 different locations and rest, and his rifle was still loaded. Why would a predator take on a formidable target like a human on a horse when there are hundreds of helpless sheep to victimize? I find it very unusual that search teams knew the exact location where Marlin had rested and bled, and still were unable to get dogs to track. Another very confusing point in this story deals with Marlin's last known location. Trackers are experts at finding people who have left tracks, especially in the woods. The June 8, 1926, article in the Salt Lake Tribune had a sectional title, Tracks Missing, with the following statement: men who are familiar with tracking animals and men have been active but have failed to find a trace of track leaving the spots where the missing boy had evidently sat down. There was some conjecture in news articles that sheep or other animals may have obliterated the tracks. Very, very doubtful. A newspaper doesn't place a statement in an article like that unless it bothered the trackers on the scene. Marlin wasn't the only victim of this indent. 1 year after he disappeared, his father died of extreme heartbreak from missing his boy. This entire event bothered me immensely. Tracks don't disappear, and bloodhounds don't arbitrarily decide not to track. The June 8, 1926, article in the Billings Gazette article talked about using hounds to seek a beast. I think if we knew what the beast was, we'd understand what happened to Marlin. Violet Karen Young. Missing 07/04/56 p.m., 7 miles north of Widstow, UT. Age at disappearance, 15 months. You may have a difficult time locating Widstow on a map. The city rose to a size of just over 1,000 in the early 1900s. When the United States Forest Service moved its office out of the city, the town became a ghost town. There are still farmers and ranchers in the outlying community, and that is exactly where this incident happened. 7 miles north of the city was the Newell Steed Ranch, a property owned by the grandparents of 15-month-old Violet Young. On July 4, 1956, Mr. and Mrs. Carrie Young were attending a 4th of July barbecue at their parents' ranch. There were fields of very tall alfalfa in the surrounding region and large mountains. Beyond them, there was also a large irrigation canal just outside the property. There was essentially no traffic in this area, and very few residents in the surrounding 20-mile radius. The ranch sat just 15 miles from Bryce Canyon National Park and 50 miles exactly east of the location where Marlin Robb disappeared. See story just prior to this. I will confirm that it is a very rare event when people disappear in close proximity to each other, unless they are part of a cluster. These are not. The family was enjoying the barbecue with several children in attendance. In the early afternoon, the Youngs realized they couldn't find Vitaly and started to search. Searchers did find the girl's teddy bear near the perimeter of the barbecue, the last location where she was observed. A July 6, 1956, article in the Post-Register had a witness's statement related to Violet. Violet has gone up the hill and won't come back, a cousin told other members of the family. That stirred the search that lasted till dark. The search was started just minutes after the girl was last seen. It was unclear why the cousin stated that the girl would not come back. Several hundred searchers were covering the local hills those first 2 days. Look. ING for the Gert later in the same Post-Register article was this. Authorities familiar with the area discounted the possibility that a wild animal might have snatched the child. An irrigation canal running through the area was drained without success. As the search moved forward, bloodhounds especially trained to search for lost people were flown into Bryce Canyon National Park and driven to the Youngs' ranch. Both bloodhounds tracked the girl from the ranch to a rural road and then stopped. Authorities stated that it was possible that Violet was abducted, but that was a small possibility. Law enforcement authorities decided that all of the alfalfa fields needed to be cut to ensure that the girl wasn't lost in one. The fields had been covered from the air by multiple aircraft searching for the girl. Once the fields were cut, nothing was found. One of the last efforts made in the search included an Air Force helicopter from Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada. The helicopter worked in a series of low flyovers, covering almost every inch of ground in a 3-mile radius of the ranch. A July 15, 1956, article in the Times News had this update on the search. Sheriff DeWard Woodard says he has ended a search for a 2-year-old Idaho girl who disappeared from a family picnic on a remote southern Utah ranch. "We feel that the child is not in this area," Woodard said. After 10 intensive days of searching, with hundreds of searchers on foot, on horseback, and in the air, they found no evidence of exactly where Violet was located. 3 years after Violet disappeared, there was this update in the April 6, 1959 Ogden Standard. The disappearance of a 15-month-old Idaho girl remains unsolved in this southern Utah community, after investigation passed the 3-year mark. Later in the same article, Violet Young, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Carrie Young of Montview, Idaho, is still missing almost 3 years after she disappeared while visiting with her parents at a ranch near Woodstow. Summary: the fact that a 15-month-old girl was missing just 10 minutes before search efforts were initiated, and she could not be located, seems surreal. How could a girl that young move that fast without some type of assistance? The girl wasn't in the surrounding alfalfa fields, not in the irrigation canal, and seemingly nowhere in the surrounding 3 miles. The location of this event was very rural. There were only neighboring farmers and ranchers. This would no be a location that someone would accidentally stumble by. The country road where the canines allegedly tracked Vitali doesn't seem like the answer to what happened. It would appear that law enforcement discounted the canines' findings as well because they continued to search deeper and deeper into rural areas. Bryce Canyon National Park is just 15 miles east through rugged mountains. The location of this incident is just not a tie-in where law enforcement would deduct that a vehicular abduct tie-in would occur. The real question is what prompted Violet to walk away and drop her teddy bear? Bruce Farron. Missing 6/23/63-10 a.m. Pyramid Lake, Uinta Mountains, UT. Age at disappearance, 7 years. In Missing 41 I Western United States, I wrote about Garrett Bardsley, age 12, who disappeared from Q Brant Lake in the Uinta Mountains on August 20, 2004. Garrett was camping with a Boy Scout troop. He awoke early and went fishing at the lake with his father. The elevation of the lake is approximately 10,200 feet. As the pair was fishing, Garrett got his feet wet and told his dad he was going back to camp to get dry socks and shoes. Mr. Bardsley watched the boy follow the trail into a grove of trees and brush. He never saw him again. The only thing they ever found of Garrett's was a sock that they located high up in a boulder field above the elevation of Q Brant Lake. Go backward in time 49 years and travel 5 miles south, and you have the disappearance of Bruce Farron. On June 23, 1963, Bruce traveled to Pyramid Lake in the Uinta Mountains with his aunt, uncle, and cousins. The lake sits at approximately 9,700 feet in elevation and appears much like Q Brant. At approximately 0 a.m., Bruce told his aunt and uncle that he needed to use the bathroom and headed for a grove of small trees and bushes. He didn't come out. After several minutes, the aunt and uncle started to search for the boy and could not locate him. Authorities were notified. Searchers from the United States Forest Service, county sheriff, and local volunteers all went into the wilderness calling Bruce's name and attempting to locate him. At approximately 4 p.m. on June 24th, searcher Boyd Carpenter was many miles from the Pyramid Lake location and saw a boy coming down a steep trail from a set of cliffs. It was Bruce. A. June 25th, A.R. Eichel in the Salt Lake Tribune had the following head. Line: Lad walks 20 miles, feels fine. Yes, you read that right. Searchers estimated that Bruce had traveled nearly 20 miles to get to the location where he was found. Later in that same article, Carpenter said the following. Mr. Carpenter said he was amazed that the boy came down over some 500-foot-high cliffs to reach the trail along the North Fork of the Duchesne River. Let's review the last few sentences. The boy walks over 20 miles in 30 hours, and then successfully goes over the top and back down 500-foot cliffs. Every search and rescue manual I have reviewed indicates that boys 7 to 9 years old will be found inside a radius of 7.2 miles 95% of the time, and that could be over a period of a week. Bruce was returned to his parents, where he stated he was hungry. He stated that he had drank water from a waterfall and slept between two down logs. He explained that as he was sleeping, a deer jumped over the top of him, and he had seen many animals during his trip. He never explained how he got lost or what he did in the early moments when he disappeared. Gage Waymont, missing 10/25/01 noon, Chalk Creek Basin, 35 miles east of Salt Lake City, UT. Age at disappearance: 2 years. Paul Waymont married a woman, becoming her third husband, and they had one child together, Gage. The combined Waymont family now had 5 children, with many rumors swirling about the welfare of the kids. Paul was a construction worker that was raised in the Mormon church. He didn't drink alcohol or use drugs. He would be viewed as a very straight-laced guy. As the marriage went forward, things went so and Paul left, asking the court for full custody of Gage. The case went to court, and Mrs. Waymont even Tooley lost custody of all her children, and Paul became Mr. Mom for Gage. The pair was inseparable. Paul had a love of the outdoors and took the boy with him everywhere, trekking through the forest, looking at sights, and generally being best buddies. On October 25, 2001, Paul, age 37, placed Gage in his car seat behind him in his 1997 Dodge pickup. The boys were headed to a private deer hunting spot on the east side of Elk Reservoir at the Chalk Creek Basin at an approximate elevation of 8,000 feet. It was approximately noon when Paul stopped his truck, walked to the gate, and correctly applied the combination to the lock. He opened the gate, entered the private domain, closed the gate behind him, and relocked it. He drove to a spot he felt would be a good location to scout for deer. Paul stopped the truck, turned around, and saw Gage asleep in his full-length blue pajamas that covered his feet. Paul was planning on being gone only a short time and decided to leave Gage locked in the truck, and strapped in his seat. Paul left to look for deer. While he was out looking, he saw several groups and apparently got preoccupied. Paul returned to the truck. Times vary on this from 30 to 90 minutes to find the door on Gage's side open and Gage gone. Paul ran throughout the area, calling Gage's name, and didn't get an answer. After looking for the boy and not having any luck, he drove down the private road to the camp and contacted 2 hunters who also happened to drive in that afternoon. The hunters told Paul that they had seen his son in the truck smiling when they drove by, and he looked fine, they felt. The father was somewhere close by. The hunters agreed to help in the search, and the trio left. The men searched for Gage and soon realized they needed more assistance and contacted the Summit County Sheriff's Office. The first deputy arriving at the scene found a frantic scene. As the DEP was trying to gather facts about Gage, Paul was vomiting and stating that if the boy died, it was his fault. He left him alone. Paul slowly calmed down, and the information about Gage was given to other deputies through the Sheriff's Communication Center. By midnight, the weather turned gloomy, and it started to snow. The temperature in the surrounding mountains had been steadily dropping, and survival for Gage was a real question. At 3 a.m., there were numerous deputies and search and rescue (SER) personnel in the area starting to search the region. Paul was seated in a SAR commander's car along with two Summit County detectives. The father was not sidestepping liability on this issue. He readily admitted this was entirely his fault. The time passed, and days went by. Salt Lake City sent its helicopter to look through the hills and creek beds in search of Gage. There were hundreds of searchers, deputies, and friends that scoured the mountains for the small boy. Several bloodhounds were brought to the scene and apparently couldn't find a scent. After 4 long and cold days of searching, the Summit County Sheriff made a determination that they couldn't find Gage Waymont. The investigative arm of the sheriff's office was concerned that the body of a 2-year-old boy couldn't be found. Searchers would continually ask themselves how a 2-year-old could get outside an area they were searching. There was initial concern that Gage may have been kidnapped. That theory was quickly quelled when all realized that access to this area is tightly controlled by lock and gate. The 2 hunters who assisted Paul with the initial search affirmed that they were the only people in that area when Gage vanished. After the search by the sheriff's office was terminated, the very next morning 150 private citizens arrived, ready and willing to continue the search. There were additional rumors that Paul had hidden Gage in an effort to permanently keep him from his mother. There were also rumors that Paul had killed Gage. This didn't make a lot of sense because of what the hunters had observed. When the volunteers arrived Monday morning to search, James Wilkes, a 35-year-old owner of a pet care facility in Salt Lake City, arrived with his black schnauzer, Dino, to assist. James is a short-haired, clean-cut man who is also a Mormon. If you saw a photo of James, he would remind you of a rugged-looking Marine, strong and determined. As some searchers stayed in pairs, James stayed with Dino and headed into an outer area, quite a distance from the area where Gage was last seen. As morning turned to afternoon, and then to early night, James and Dino were lost. Yes, the searchers themselves were lost and cold. James found some protection from the elements in a small hole under a tree, and this is where he sat bundled with Dino for one of the coldest nights of their lives. James wasn't sure if he slept at all during that night, but he is sure that he probably started back up. At nearly 5 a.m., Wilkes states that he and Dino had only been moving a few minutes when he noticed his dog bent over a small bulge butte in 5 inches of snow. Wilkes slowly got over to Dino's position and realized the dog was now licking the face of Gage Waymont. Gage was lying in a fetal position facing uphill under the snow. His hands were clenched in fists, his eyes were open with frozen tears in them. The blue footy pajamas were pulled up to his knees, and his throat was blue. The boy was dead. James made one last observation before placing Gage in his arms. He saw canine tracks in the immediate area that were not from Dino. James picked up the body and started to make his way out of the woods. It was an arduous trek. After many hours of trying to work his way out of his lost environment, James eventually had to put the boy's body down near a fence line and then continue to work his way back to the search area headquarters, where he reported his find to sheriff's deputies. The deputies responded back into the area, and eventually, they found Gage as James had explained. Paul broke down when he was told of James's find. There was some relief among the rescue workers that they had found the body, yet there was much grief that Gage had passed on. The Summit County Sheriff was highly concerned that they had been unable to find the body with their search and rescue personnel, and an outsider with his dog made the find. Paul was asked to take a polygraph test about the circumstances surrounding his son's disappearance. Paul's statement never swayed. He took full responsibility and testified just as he had made statements to other deputies and investigators. The polygraph examiner asked him if he and James Wilkes had plotted together to cause the death of Gage. He stated that he had not. Paul passed the polygraph. as Paul jumped through one legal investigative hoop. He was having his own internal struggles with understanding how Gage had gotten out of his truck. Paul's sister stated that Paul would regularly go out to the truck and work the locks and the buckles, never understanding how Gage was able to accomplish this feat. Sheriff's investigators continued their investigation by having the medical examiner perform an autopsy on Gage. The determined cause of death was exposure, yet the examiner couldn't determine when Gage died. Investigators took their case to the deputy district attorney and made their feelings known about possible prosecution. Everyone agreed that Paul had made a severe mistake. The personal feeling of the investigators was that Paul was the type of person who would jive with this incident for the rest of his life, his own personal hell that would never leave. They believed that was punishment enough. The district attorney's office had a different feeling about pros. Equitio an. The amount of time Paul had left Gage in his truck had varied, according to reports, from 30 to 90 minutes, and they couldn't pin it any closer. He left the boy in a cold environment, strapped in a car seat, alone. The boy had exited the seat and somehow managed to cross miles of wilderness to his eventual place of death. Paul was eventually charged with 1 count of misdemeanor negligent homicide. While the district attorney was contemplating the decision to charge, Paul was getting a barrage of hatred flowing his way. The news media had reported that Paul's ex-wife was being investigated on a variety of child custody type issues. Nothing was ever alleged against Paul. Not QNLY was this man living with the knowledge that his actions killed his boy. He was being bombarded by a section of the public that wanted his scalp. On June 5th, after much discussion with his attorneys and family, Paul Wayment pleaded guilty to 1 count of negligent homicide. Paul didn't want to put others in the way of public humiliation by testifying. He knew what he did, and family members felt as though Paul wanted to pay a price for his actions. Paul read sheriff's reports and found the location where Gage died. This became a location he regularly went to meditate. He eventually built a small shrine to Gage, alone, and at the last location that Gage had ever known. Paul had talked with his sister about his feelings of suicide but countered them with the religious knowledge that if he ever did that, it was the Mormons' belief that a suicide would never allow the victim to reach the same eternal resting area as others who died naturally under God's grace, and it was that fear that he'd never see his boy that kept Paul from committing the act. On July 17th, Paul was sentenced to 30 days in jail. The judge felt that he needed to spend some jail time as a message to other parents. The judge asked Paul when he'd like to start a sentence, and Paul and his attorney agreed to start the 30 days the folio's lowing morning. As people left the courthouse, Paul told his sister that he was going back to the mountain, a normal place for him to meditate and be in that environment. He needed to be with Gage. The morning of July 18th came, and Paul did not arrive for sun. Tensing. Paul's sister called his house, no answer. It was at this point that people started to feel the worst. Several individuals went to Paul's meditation location and found his body lying next to his rifle. Summary. 147. In my years of conducting research on missing people, I don't believe I've ever investigated a story with so many twists, turns, and agony. But this isn't why this story is in the book. Let me first state that I can only try to feel what Paul felt after losing a son, as I have never lost a child. Thank God. When you have a bond with a child, there is nothing that comes close. I believe that Paul was a decent man who made a bad decision, probably the one decision that would forever haunt any loving parent. Part of Paul's core, taking responsibility for one's actions, that one personal trait, is what doomed this man. I don't believe it was the court's decision to incarcerate or the district attorneys to prosecute. It was the ethics of the man that put him in such strife. I have read several accounts of children being left alone in vehicles in the woods where they somehow got out, and suppository Edley started to trek. before I read the portion of Paul's story where he was attempting to understand how Gage out of his truck, unlocking locks, pulling on door handles, etc., one was imagining the same things. I've documented many cases where the weather turns bad after a child vanishes. In this case, it started to snow near midnight. James Wilkes made a fascinating observation when he was picking up Gage canine tracks in the snow near his body. The implication of the tracks was that searchers were close to find this boy. Why hadn't the dogs reacted? I've read tales where some animals are reluctant or afraid of approaching other dead animals in specific situations. Was that what was happening here? Why? Gage was found just a little over 2 miles from the point he was last seen. Several articles claim it was in an area that had been searched thoroughly. Again, a situation that occurs far too many times in the incidents I've investigated. I do not condone what Paul did by leaving Gage in the truck. It was a horrific case of bad judgment, but I feel compassion for his loss. The missing 411 books were not printed in 2001, but I hope that anyone else that gets in Paul's position has the opportunity to read them. They wouldn't feel as though they were alone. I gleaned much of this story from over 4.Thai articles I reviewed. There is one particular rendition of the total account that assisted in helping me form this story: a father's pain, a judge's duty, and a justice beyond their reach, by Barry Siegel of the Los Angeles Times. His story won a Pulitzer Prize and is worth looking up on the web. Barry Siegel's ability to explain this specific incident is extraordinary. I shed a lot of tears over this story, and I don't think that Paul was 0% at fault. Asterisk refer to missing 411 Western United States and the October 1973 disappearance of Jimmy Duffy, 2 years old, from the back of a camper while his parents left him alone. Many of the facts in this case mimic Gage's disappearance, and there are other cases that are very similar. Eric Robinson, missing 8/07/LL, Highline Trail, Uintas Wilderness, UT. Age at disappearance, 63 years. Eric Robinson and Marilyn Coulsett lived in the outskirts of Melbourne, Australia. Marilyn was the principal at Boxstone Primary School in East Bentley, and Eric was the explorer and adventurer. Mr. Robinson had hiked nearly every major trail in his home country and then started tackling trails in New Zealand, Scotland, California, and Utah. He was very experienced, and he researched his hikes at length and did extensive reading on all aspects of the region where he was going. Eric had a red backpack, tent, sleeping bag, bear spray, personal transponder, cell phone, and 14 days of supplies for a 10-day, 60-mile hike on the Highline Trail in the Uintas Wilderness in far northeast Utah. In late July, Marilyn dropped Eric at the Melbourne airport and sent him off for another hiking excursion. Friends of the Robinsons picked Eric up in Salt Lake City and hosted him overnight in Park City. Eric gave his friends intimate details about his trip and told them to expect him at Mirror Lake on A1.1, Gus 7. He was dropped at the Highline Trailhead on July 28. On August 2nd, a troop of Boy Scouts and its leaders just happened to meet Eric in the Yellowstone Creek drainage, nearly 4 miles off track from the Highline Trail. The troop stated that Eric was in fine health and upbeat spirits. The leader of the troop gave Eric directions on his map regarding how to get back to the correct trail and sent him hiking in that direction. This was the last time Eric Robinson was ever seen. Friends of Eric's were waiting at Mirror Lake on August 7. After the 63-year-old hiker didn't arrive, they determined something was drastically wrong and notified the United States Forest Service and the Duchesne County Sheriff's Department. County Sheriff Travis Mitchell led the effort to find Eric. The search included helicopters, equestrians, all-terrain vehicles, bloodhounds, and hikers. Sheriff Mitchell contacted Marilyn and She explained that Eric was in excellent health and passionate about hiking and exploring. He was a competent hiker who went the extra distance to ends. He had extra supplies should he be stuck for Addie. Final days in the wild. 15 intensive days of searching for Eric Robinson found nothing. The rescue teams had a fairly confined area in which to look for the man, based on the Boy Scouts' observation of August 2. Marilyn realized the effort was coming to a close and flew to Utah. All search operations were terminated on August 22nd. Marilyn did continue the effort to find Eric by placing posters and photos around the various trailheads in the area. All efforts to find Eric were eventually terminated without one piece of equipment ever being found. Summary: Eric started his hike 1 mile west of Q Brant Lake, the Loca tie-in where 12-year-old Garrett Bardsley disappeared on August 20, 2004 and was never found. Eric never activated his personal transponder or his cell phone. He was carrying a bright-colored backpack stocked with supplies. Searchers had a location where they knew he was last seen and placed a series of bloodhounds at that site, yet they could never pick up a scent. Helicopters could not locate him or his supplies from the air. This region of Utah has very high elevations without significant ground coverage. There are hundreds of small lakes, creeks, and rivers and miles of exposed boulders. This man did everything wrecked in preparation for his hike, except for one item that I adamantly recommend: always hike with a partner. It is somewhat ironic that Eric was last seen by a group of Boy Scouts. Garrett Bardsley was on a Boy Scout outing when he vanished and was never found.